Good evening, everyone. It's a great joy to be here and to participate in this pilgrimage of life with all of you. As Cardinal Wuerl said, it's so great to have so many young people here. 4 decades ago, when we started the march and these vigils, I'm sure that the proponents of abortion thought, well, those people are going to die off and this will go away. Well, we haven't died off and it hasn't gone away. More and more young people have responded and come to be a part of the campaign for the gospel of life, and we congratulate you and thank you. And the weather is just perfect because the colder it is, the better our witness. People know we're serious. That's why we're here. And so thank you very much. You know, half of the young Catholics in the United States are Hispanic. I'd just like to greet them, if you would indulge me. A los jóvenes hispanos católicos, yo les saludo con mucho cariño. Para mí resultó una inmensa alegría participar en la Jornada Mundial de la Juventud con nuestro querido Santo Padre, el Papa Francisco, en Río, y ver allí millones de jóvenes celebrando nuestra fe católica. Su presencia acá nos llena de esperanza y nutre nuestra ilusión de anunciar el Evangelio de la vida con un entusiasmo incansable. Hoy se festeja la Virgen de Alta Gracia, que la intercesión de la Santísima Virgen y el Patriarca San José mantenga nuestras familias verdaderos santuarios de la vida. Jóvenes hispanos, Cristo cuenta con ustedes, su iglesia cuenta con ustedes. Almost 200 years ago, the Danish writer Hans Christian Andersen wrote a wonderful story called The Emperor's New Clothes. It's a story of a very proud, vain king who thought so much of new clothes that he spent all of his money on his apparel. His only ambition was to be the best dressed. One day, 2 swindlers arrived in the city and convinced the king to buy a new suit made of a magical material that was invisible. They told the king that those who could not see the cloth were stupid and unfit to rule. The king was quite deceived and paraded through the streets of his capital to receive the ovations of his people. The crowds lined the street and applauded when the king passed by. The crowd shouted compliments and congratulated the king on his magnificent clothing. Suddenly, a little child shouted, "But he doesn't have anything on." The king continued on his way. His chamberlains walked with still greater dignity, as if they were carrying the train of his robe, which did not exist. The king's new clothes today are called reproduction rights, termination of pregnancy, choice, and many other euphemisms that disguise the reality and the brutality that is abortion. The crowd applauds the king's new clothes. People are afraid to question. And those who do not applaud must be stupid, naive, obstinate. The voice of the church is like the child who declares before the world that the new clothes are a lie, a humbug, a deception. The church, with the candor of a child, must call out the uncomfortable truth. Abortion is wrong. Thou shalt not kill. Our first reading tonight is from the book of Deuteronomy. In this last sermon before he dies on Mount Nebo, Moses tells God's people, "I've set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life, that you and your descendants might live by loving the Lord, obeying his voice, and holding fast to him. That will be life for you." Choose life is the message of the church confronted by the king's new clothes. Choose life. John Paul II commented on the many declarations of human rights and many initiatives inspired by these ideals that seem to indicate a growing moral sensitivity, more alert to acknowledge the value and dignity of every individual as a human being, without any distinction of race, nationality, religion, political persuasion, or social class. Sadly, these noble proclamations are contradicted by a tragic repudiation of them in practice. This denial is still more distressing, indeed more scandalous, precisely because it is occurring in a society which makes affirmation and protection of human rights its primary objective and boast. The Holy Father, Pope John Paul, asks, how can we reconcile these repeated declarations of human rights with the continual increase and widespread justification of attacks on human life? How can we reconcile these declarations with the refusal to accept those who are weak and needy or elderly or those who have just been conceived? These attacks go directly against respect for life, and they represent a direct threat to the entire culture of human rights. It jeopardizes the very meaning of democratic coexistence. Rather than societies of people living together, we risk becoming societies of people who are rejected, marginalized, uprooted, and oppressed. When the church raises the prophetic cry, "Choose life," we're performing a great service to all of society. Life is sacred. Life is a mystery. Life must be protected, nurtured, respected. The gospel of life is the centerpiece of the church's social teaching. When the value of life is compromised or diminished, all life is at risk. When we give the state the power to determine which human beings are worthy of living and which should be eliminated, what we're doing is opening up a Pandora's box that unleashes every kind of injustice and violation of human dignity. Life is precious. The transmission of life, sexuality, marriage, which is the sanctuary of life, are all sacred. The Church's consistent life ethic contrasts with the incoherent proclamation of human rights that fails to protect the most vulnerable. Human rights without the right to life are the king's new clothes. It's a fraud. It's an exercise in self-deception. When Roe versus Wade was handed down over 40 years ago, Archibald Cox, the Harvard University expert in constitutional law and Watergate prosecutor, stated, "This decision fails even to consider what I suppose to be the most compelling interest of the state in prohibiting abortion, the interest in maintaining that respect for the paramount sanctity of human life, which has always been at the center of Western civilization. Yes, the Church's pro-life message is a great service to all society. The culture of death flows out of the extreme individualism of our age. The Church's antidote is community and solidarity. Pope Francis is always talking about the culture of encounter. In his stunning apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, Pope Francis writes, "Among the vulnerable for whom the Church wishes to care with particular love and concern are unborn children, the most defenseless and innocent among us." Pope Francis goes on to say, frequently attempts are made to ridicule the Church's efforts to defend the unborn. Attempts are made to present the Church's teaching as ideological, obscurantist, and conservative. Yet this defense of unborn life is closely linked to the defense of each and every other human right. The Holy Father laments the fact that we haven't done enough to accompany women in very difficult situations. The good news is that God never gives up on us. He never tires of loving us, never tires of forgiving us, never tires of giving us a second chance. The pro-life movement needs to be the merciful face of God to women facing a difficult pregnancy. Being judgmental or condemnatory is not part of the gospel of life. In pre-revolutionary Cuba, a Catholic radio play was broadcast that caused quite a bit of attention at the time. It was called La Muralla. It's the story of a middle-class Catholic family, husband, wife, and 5 children. Each Sunday, the whole family went to Mass together. They all went to communion except the father. This was a source of great anxiety. The wife and the children were always encouraging their dad to go to confession and join them at the communion rail. He resisted all their pleading. The years passed. The man grew old, and when he was dying, his wife sent for the priest who came and gave him the last sacraments. After making his confession and receiving Holy Communion, the man called his wife and children around his deathbed and said to them, "Before I die, there's something I need to tell you. The reason I could not go to communion for all these years was that when I was a young lawyer, I falsified a will. All the money we have really should belong to a distant cousin of ours. I knew that if I went to confession, I would have to make restitution, so I waited until now." With that, the man died. But from that day on, it was his wife and children who stopped going to communion because they didn't want to make restitution either. We're often quick to judge people because we have not walked in their shoes. Until we find ourselves in the same situation, we don't know. We might do the same thing that we're judging others for. Today's gospel is one of the most dramatic scenes in the New Testament. The Pharisees are determined to impale Jesus on the horns of a dilemma. Should the woman caught in adultery be punished by death, as the law demanded? If Jesus said no, they would accuse him of neglecting to obey the law. If Jesus said yes, kill her, they would have tried to discredit Jesus to the people. The Pharisees brought that woman along almost like a stage prop to use her for their political purposes. It's interesting to note that her partner has escaped punishment. It's only the woman who pays the price for their actions. She's filled with shame and in fear for her life, with feelings of anger, despair, disappointment, and a profound sense of loneliness. It's curious to note that this is the only place in the gospel where we see Jesus writing something. For Jesus, there was no need to publish or perish. We don't know for sure what Jesus was writing, but some of the fathers of the church speculate that Jesus was writing the sins of those brave men. And then he tells them that the one who is without sin should cast the first stone. When the men see their sins, the stones fall from their hands, and they begin to sneak away, starting with the oldest. Jesus is left alone with the woman. The crowd, with their prurient curiosity, and the Pharisees, disarmed by Jesus, have slipped away. St. Augustine describes this scene as miseria et misericordia, misery and mercy meet. Jesus has come not for the healthy, but for the sick. He's come to set up that field hospital that Pope Francis talks about. Jesus is the Good Shepherd who leaves the 99 behind to seek out that one lost sheep that gives him more joy than the 99. The feelings of the woman in today's gospel must be like the young woman caught in a crisis situation of an unwanted pregnancy. She feels overwhelmed, alone, afraid, and confused. We never want to allow that woman to perceive the pro-life movement as a bunch of angry, self-righteous Pharisees with stones in their hands, looking down upon her and judging her. We want the woman to experience the merciful love of Christ. Jesus does not condone the woman's fall, but he does not condemn her. He invites her to make a new start, to know that she is forgiven and loved. Pope Francis urges us to practice that art of accompaniment, which teaches us to remove our sandals before the sacred ground of the other, in this case, the woman in crisis. This accompaniment must be steady and reassuring, reflecting our closeness and compassionate gaze that heals, liberates, and encourages growth in the Christian life. This is precisely what the Sisters of Life, Project Rachel, the Community of Jesus, the Living Mercy, and so many others are doing. We are here because we want to save thousands of innocent children who this year will be executed by the very people whose mission should be to heal and protect life. The truth is that the only way that we can save those babies is by saving the mothers. When they experience God's loving mercy, then they will be capable of showing that mercy to their children. The pro-life movement has to be about saving mothers. We need to focus on the woman to try to understand what she is suffering. The work of our pregnancy crisis centers has helped countless women to be able to choose life. We owe a great debt of gratitude to the volunteers and workers at those centers. There are millions of women in our country who have had abortions. There are millions of men who pushed them, encouraged them, and drove them to the abortion clinic. Wouldn't it be wonderful if some of them could accept John Paul II's challenge to those who have chosen abortion to recommit themselves to life, whether by accepting the birth of another child, the Holy Father says, or by welcoming and caring for those most in need of someone to be close to them, to become promoters of a new way of looking at human life. One person who took up this challenge was Dr. Bernard Nathanson, the founder of NARAL and the pro-abortion movement in the United States. In the 1970s, Dr. Nathanson ran an abortion clinic in New York City, which operated from 8 a.m. until midnight. He performed roughly 100 abortions a day. But then, having promoted abortion and convincing people of its urgency, Bernard Nathanson, the tailor that produced the King's New Clothes in the United States, finally heard that child's voice pointing out the inconvenient truth. His conscience could no longer allow him to fool himself into believing it was not a human being. Dr. Bernard Nathanson became one of the most eloquent opponents of abortion and the abortion industry. In 1982, I invited him to come and to speak to the Black and Hispanic leaders of the Archdiocese of Washington right here on this campus. A few years later, Dr. Nathanson accompanied me to Honduras, where he presented his film, The Silent Scream, to the medical faculty and on the national television. He was instrumental in getting the laws that legalized abortion in Honduras reversed. And he spent the rest of his life trying to do the same in the United States. God's grace turned Saul of Tarsus, the implacable persecutor of the church, into the apostle of the Gentiles. And that grace transformed Bernard Nathanson into an apostle of the gospel of life. The antidote to abortion is solidarity, community, where people are willing to care for each other and for the most vulnerable. The message of the gospel of life is, as Pope Francis tells us in Evangelii Gaudium, a message of joy. The Holy Father writes, "To those who feel far from God and the Church, and to all who are fearful or indifferent, I would like to say this: the Lord, with great respect and love, is calling you to be part of His people. The Church must be a place of mercy, freely given, where everyone can be welcomed, loved, forgiven, and encouraged to live the good life of the gospel. The very heart of the gospel is life in community and engagement with others." The challenge Pope Francis places before our young people is to be evangelizers, and to evangelize with beauty and with joy. The Holy Father says, to communicate the moral teaching that promotes growth in the gospel way of life, it's helpful to stress again and again the attractiveness and the ideal of a life of wisdom, self-fulfillment, and enrichment. In light of that positive message, our rejection of evils which endanger life can be better understood. Rather than experts in dire predictions and dour judges, we should appear as joyful messengers of challenging proposals, guardians of the goodness and beauty which shines forth in a life of fidelity to the gospel. At Lampedusa, Pope Francis cast a wreath into the sea where thousands of poor immigrants lost their lives. He warned about the globalization of indifference. We face this in the pro-life movement. Just as with slavery in the past, today many people are repulsed by abortion, but believe that it's a necessary evil. Our task is to show them that it is not necessary, but it is evil. Where there are community and solidarity, more humane solutions present themselves when there's a difficult pregnancy. When the abortion decision of the Supreme Court was handed down, the logical response the pro-life movement was a resolute call for adoption, not abortion. The truth is, each year there are fewer and fewer adoptions, while there are more than 1 million abortions every year. Many young Americans don't know anyone who is adopted. And if they do know someone, it's probably someone from China, Russia, Guatemala, giving the impression that entrusting a child to an adoptive family is not something that Americans do. The history of adoption is not always a glorious one. There's a popular film in the theaters right now portraying some of the worst practices of the past. Philomena, portrayed by Dame Judi Dench, tells the story of a young girl forced to give up her baby. It's a tragic history. We need people to hear the good stories of adoptions, of courageous birth mothers and generous adoptive families that have truly provided a loving family for an adopted child. In Boston, we're making adoption part of the pro-life curriculum for our young people. The majority of women who succumb to abortion are poor. Poverty is a dehumanizing force that leads people to feel trapped and to make this horrible choice. The gospel of life demands that we work for economic justice in our country and in our world. In a society where the rich are getting ever richer and the poor poorer, abortion looms ever large. Remember, Planned Parenthood was founded to eliminate the poor. We can rescue unborn babies from abortion by rescuing their mothers from a life of poverty and hopelessness. Pope Francis challenges our complacency and indifference to the oppressive poverty that spawns so many abortions. Yes, the Catholic Church's consistent life ethic is a great service to society. It's our task to witness to the truth that love, compassion, and solidarity can build a just society that will be safer for the poor, the unborn, and those on the periphery. I often share with people the fact that in Massachusetts, on the island of Martha's Vineyard, there's a beautiful church dedicated to St. Augustine. And there are lovely stained glass windows in the church that depict the 7 sacraments. When a tourist enters the church, the very first window that they see is one that represents the sacrament of reconciliation, with the cross keys, the priest's stole, and the words from today's gospel, "Go and sin no more." But the church isn't air-conditioned, so in the hot days of summer, they open all the windows. Well, the only pane of glass in that particular window is the part where the word "no" appears. So tourists enter the church and they see the window that says, "Go and sin more." Now, in my 10 years as bishop there, no one has ever complained about that window. The irony is that many people think of us Catholics as the people of no, don't do this, don't do that. In reality, we are the people of yes. Yes to God, yes to life, yes to compassion for the poor and the suffering, yes to solidarity and community that make us messengers of joy, even in a valley of tears. The gospel of life will always trump the King's new clothes. God bless you.